morning. Welcome to Monday at Artexpo New York. Today is a special day. First of all, let me introduce myself to you. I'm Linda Mariano. I'm the Managing Director of Marketing for Artexpo New York and all of the shows that Redwood Media Group produces. Today is a special day. Not only is it Monday at Artexpo New York, but it's International Sculpture Day. Hundreds of special sculpture events are happening around the United States and around the world. And we're lucky this morning to have Sculpture Magazine and Glenn Harper and some of the writers for Sculpture Magazine with us to talk about writing sculpture and a little bit about celebrating International Sculpture Day. So I'm going to let them take it away. Glenn?
I'm Glenn Harper. The publication I edit, which is called Sculpture, is a publication of the International Sculpture Center, which is also the sponsor of International Sculpture Day around the world. Just trying to look out there. Are you artists, or what's your connection to the art world? Any artists? Raise your hand. Good. Other connections with the art world? Collectors? We're going to talk about translating the artwork into writing for the purpose of criticism. And part of it in relation to the art fairs. Jerry Saltz said a few years ago that the one person who is unwelcome at the art fairs is the writer. There's no place for the writers in the art fairs. You're not totally right, but I think the art fairs are really about something else. More reminds me of something Gary, Indiana did back years ago when he was a critic for the Village Voice. He started being upset that galleries were just using whatever he wrote, positive or negative, as promotion for the artist. So he started writing first more negative comments, and the galleries still posted them as PR for their artists. Then he started just doing monologues about his day or his week, and it had the artist's name at the top as if it was a review, so the galleries still posted them as PR for their artists. So he stopped writing criticism because he didn't want to be part of the PR machine. That's another little bit about the relationship between writing and the art world that we can talk about. We can also talk about the magazines, of which there are a lot fewer as time goes by, about the business of writing. Art writing was never the best paid way to get by. It's probably the least paid form of journalism. But now more and more journals are expecting writers to do it for free. So the economics of writing about art has changed a great deal. We'll start off the discussion. This is Robert Morgan and Joyce Bekenstein. And as we go along, it's hard to see from up here. So if you have a question, you could raise your hand, but you might also need to speak up. So I might not be able to see your hand. So maybe just a brief comment from first Joyce and then Robert about our discussion today.
Well, I just thought we were going to have fun with this.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things as an arts writer, for me, is really distinguishing the different kinds of articles and why you write about something. Especially if you're freelance and you are going around and you're kind of deciding what it is that interests you, that you want to write about. How do you choose what you're going to write about? Where so much of the art world and the art market are intertwined, for me it's always a question of where do you come in? Where does the art writer kind of use that forum as leverage to put the art that he or she is looking at in some kind of cultural context?
Well, sculpture is important, and I write about it, and therefore I take it very seriously. But before I get into that, I would just like to congratulate Glenn Harper for the fact that he's been at this publication for 21 years. I didn't realize it had been quite that long. And I remember when the publication started out, a little before that, and it's come a long, long way. And looking at that publication, and you can see various issues on the seats, which I guess you're welcome to take. It's extremely sophisticated, and it's read throughout the world. It's popular in Europe, in China, in South America, even in the Middle East. And so this vehicle that Glenn has managed over the years has taken on a certain real importance, and frankly, I can't imagine where things would be in terms of sculpture without this publication, because it lends an aura of seriousness to what it means to work with materials in 3 dimensions, and also to clarify some of the issues, because sometimes people think that a sculpture is anything in 3D space, as I heard one writer from the New York Times say, which I strongly disagree with. I think you have to have a mind, you have to have knowledge, you have to have a history, you have to be good with materials. There's so much complexity in terms of making authentic sculpture that really resonates. And sometimes it goes beyond the object, many times beyond the object nowadays, into installations both out of doors and indoors, sometimes even on a conceptual level. So without a major publication like sculpture, few people who come in contact with these forms have any idea what they're looking at, because they need some kind of guide, some kind of understanding from perhaps writers who have had a good deal of experience working with sculpture or being around sculpture and thinking about sculpture. But it's a magnificent art, as great as music or architecture, in my opinion. And I'm very happy that you are here to listen to us make a few of our comments.
Do you think that sculpture is more difficult to write about than painting or other forms of art?
Yes, I do, because you have to decide whether or not it's sculpture. Sometimes it's science, sometimes it's politics, and it's a form that is wrapped up with those kinds of things. I just have the current issue of sculpture with me, and I went through it because that there's such diversity that I think maybe 20 years ago, I don't know if you as an editor would have even thought about some of the things that are in here as being in the, I mean, there's one artist who works with beehives. There's another one who works with sound and translates sound into sculpture. There's in the same volume a piece about Tanya Bruguera, who's a political activist who may not make a particular object, but who may just be advocating some kind of a movement or some kind of a protest. And yet all of this comes under the title of sculpture. So sometimes I find it difficult to decide whether it's sculpture or not sculpture. I don't know if Robert shares that.
Yes, I come in contact with that problem on a regular basis, and I'm glad you mentioned it, Joyce, because I think that a critical consciousness in relation to what we see in art is something that is gradually slipping, and because of criticism, I think we can bring it back into focus. Criticism is where you take a close look and you analyze what's there, and you try and provoke some kind of qualitative judgment in relation to why the work might be important. And if the work is important, it's got to somehow hold its reality in space and time. It's got to be something that is, I think, provocative, but not necessarily in the outright sense. I think very quiet sculpture can be, like, I'm thinking of some of Bernard Venet's arcs, for example. I wouldn't consider those provocative in an outward sense, but the more you look at them, the more you think about them, there is something going on that tells us about the society in which we live and about who we are as individuals living in that society, which is very mechanistic and very detached. And I think that sculpture can bring you closer to an understanding of some of these ideas, some of these feelings.
There's an East European critic who wrote about artworks as interrogation machines, meaning that the art is interrogating reality, it's interrogating art, it's interrogating daily life, that art that's effective in space or art that's effective in any other way is art that does something. It isn't just an object in space, it isn't just a decoration, it does something. I can tell you that the diversity in the magazine is led by artists. The first publication I worked for was an outgrowth of the Art Workers Coalition, which was a movement for giving artists voices back to themselves, not to be totally under the control of critics and curators and magazine editors like me. But it planted a seed in me that we need to listen to artists and let artists guide us where they're going, as long as they are doing something authentic. So the diversity in the magazine and the diversity of materials means that whether they even call themselves sculptors or not is driven by what the artists are able to create and present and make us believe in.
You know, there's am I on? Yes, there I am. There's something that has developed over the last 20 years or so. You know, when I came into art, I first came in as an artist, and then eventually I got my PhD. So I've been teaching for a long time, and I remember this term installation. It used to be a term when you installed an exhibition, either of painting or of sculpture or photographs, whatever it happened to be, when there were those, shall we say, mediumistic categories. But now things are kind of blended together. And so when you talk about installation, you're talking about a form of sculpture that is extending into space and time, as I suggested a moment ago. And I think that there is a kind of trajectory, and I think it's got a very feminist orientation from my point of view, at least the kind of installation I'm thinking of. I did a lecture about 2 weeks ago, beginning with Louise Nevelson. I took it through Ree Morton, I took it through Judy Paff and Sarah Z. And I thought that it was an interesting kind of lineage, because all of these artists were looking for forms outside of the history of the museum, where singular objects were housed. And they were trying to break through into something else. And I think it's fascinating. And therefore, a great deal of what we have to deal with in the magazine, when I say have to, I mean we have to, because it's what's happening right now, is what these installation forms are all about, and what they mean, and how they, again, put us in contact with the reality of which we're a part.
Well, I find that covering the installations, I agree with Robert, are really very, very interesting, because they force you to kind of look at something from many, many different perspectives. I'll give an example. I went to see the Manifesto exhibition. Did you see that at the Armory? And it was one of the most fascinating exhibits I had seen, all of these screens dealing with different manifestos from art history, all acted out in different contexts by Kate Blanchett, who was a wonderful actress. And when I first walked in, I was staggered by just the physical installation of, I don't know how, maybe there were 12 or 13 videos that were ongoing, and I saw it as a video installation. And as I walked from one to the other, they were all dealing with the idea of a concept about what art is, with the same artist. And when I would stand back, there were moments in that installation where you would have a split second of Kate Blanchett's head in her different guises at the same time. And then at the same time, and it would only happen for a split second, there would be profiles. And I said to myself, oh my God, this is sculpture, you know, because you're really looking at a visual thing in multi-dimensions from different points of view, from different points in time, art historically. And so suddenly, as I'm in this space, my idea of what I'm looking at, defining it, changes. And I think one of the things that I've come to is not to try so hard to define anything. You know, to walk in and decide, you know, is this something that provokes me? Does it take me to another level? You don't always know what you're looking at, frankly, or at least I don't, or whether or not it's sculpture or it's painting, because the lines are so blurred today. But I think that if you show a willingness to go into whatever it is you're going in to see and allow it to speak to you, I think then you can really form an opinion. And that opinion at the end of the day is going to be opinionated.
Back in the days of minimalism in the 1960s and 70s, the minimalists were attacked by the aesthetics, the school of Greenberg, for being theatrical. What they meant was that the object implicated the viewer in its reality as art, in its use of space. It required the viewer to walk around it, and I think that's where what started the germ of the serious consideration of sculpture. Before that, Barnett Newman could say sculpture is what you trip on when you back up to look at a painting. But now I think it's sculpture that forces us to consider its reality, intellectual and physical, in our own space and in life, which is somewhat different. Then I think the next step in that after minimalism was Eva Hesse, who showed that it doesn't have to be industrial materials, that you can experiment with ephemeral or impermanent materials, that you can think in different kinds of materials, and that's where I think our philosophy in Sculpture Magazine is. It's the thought, the philosophy of a work, and also the use of materials in a work that will make it interesting or that will make it not interesting if it's not as effective.
I had an interesting experience this weekend. I was writing a review of the catalog for the Marissa Mertz show at the Met Breuer. And one of the problems with her work, I mean, and there too, you know, it's sculpture, it's painting, it's installation, it's all kinds of things. But one of the things that, as I went through the book, I noticed there was really not a lot written about anything but her most seminal work, which were her early living sculpture pieces. And not much was really written about anything else. And in delving into the catalog, I learned that one of the problems curatorially in writing about her is that she was very, very private about her work, and she didn't sign it, she didn't title it, she didn't date it. So try to put together an exhibition that has some kind of art historical real context when you don't know when it was done, and there is no title. And it unnerved me a little bit to have to write about this as I was doing it, and I'm saying to myself, why did I agree to this? And then I'm just leafing through this book, and it's filled with these wonderful images that have no titles and no dates, and that aren't discussed in the context of any of the essays. And it was a most wonderful experience, because once I got over the fact that somebody was not going to really tell me what this was about, and I began to leaf through all this, all of a sudden the painting spoke to the sculpture, spoke to the drawing, in ways that really don't happen when you're surrounded by a lot of wall text. And again, I think I think that Glenn does this, and correct me if I'm wrong, Glenn, with the magazine, is that our idea of what sculpture is, as Robert said, is having to do with a form and with space and different kinds of space. What this magazine and what this whole discipline does is open us up to different ways of actually considering what it is we're looking at, interpreting it, and opening up our own minds, so we begin to see connections that may not have really existed on first sight.
One of the problems if sculpture is untitled and undated, it's extremely difficult to write about. Have you found that to be the case, Joyce?
Yeah.
Because you don't know how to put it into a chronology, for example. In other words, you don't have a way of showing how the sculpture developed unless you know. But in many cases, you don't always know. You're not always sure. That's part of where the art history comes into criticism. I was thinking about sculptors that I really like. And one that I would like to mention is a sculptor named Tom Doyle, who was married to Eva Hess. And I guess I thought of it because her name came into the discussion a moment ago. And Tom passed away recently. He was in his late 80s. And he had, I think, a fantastic career of dealing with forms that were essentially abstract expressionist forms, trying to take gestures from Franz Klein and put them into space. And he did this with wood, all kinds of wood, mahogany, pine, whatever, walnut, redwood. He would combine these, and he was always thinking in relation to the process of constructing. In other words, he didn't work it out in advance the way a sculptor like Saul DeWitt might have done, but he worked it out in relation to the thought process, the visual thought process of how the elements would go together. And I remember going up to his house in the country in Connecticut and looking at this lawn of magnificent wood sculptures that had the artist's mind embedded with him. And it was the kind of mind that really made you feel something about this work. You felt the emotional structure of the artist in looking at the work. And I guess one reason why I think so highly of Tom's work and of Tom is that he always made this attempt to establish some kind of feeling that was going to move the viewer. And to do that in sculpture, I think, is often much more challenging than to do it with a frontal surface like in painting. But he did it, and from my point of view, I think that we need to reclaim Tom Doyle in terms of his achievement and understand why that sensibility of feeling in relation to form is essential to art.
One of the things we've covered quite a bit over the years, the kinds of work, relates to the Tanya Bruguera article that we have in the current issue. More and more often we find ourselves covering either performance art per se or the ephemera related to performance art as sculpture. Is that something you think is a legitimate consideration? something like Bruguera, who's mostly a performance artist. Her work is mostly conceptual and political, and yet we're considering it as sculpture. Is that appropriate, do you think?
Oh, I think anything's appropriate if you feel it to be the case. I have a very different position about political art. I go along with Herbert Marcuse, who said there is no political art. There's only art that is looking for liberation within the oppression of politics.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think that I'm really very thrilled that there is this flexibility and this openness today in terms of not necessarily labeling something. If it's sculptural, it's maybe sculptural in ways that we didn't traditionally call sculpture. And I think that the performance work and the art that involves the audience and it becomes interactive. For something to be interactive, it almost has to be sculptural, because you're coming together, maybe not, even if you're not coming together around a specific form, like you'll be coming together around an idea. And if you're coming together around an idea, that idea in a way begins to take shape and form, be it as a demonstration, be it as a video, be it as a selfie that people are going to take. And I really do like the openness of that. And going back to this other idea about how difficult it is to write about something that doesn't have a chronology, that doesn't have a title, that has you in the dark. I really thought that Marissa Mertz was a genius in terms of doing what she did. I think that she was so ahead of the curve, because actually what she is thus forcing you to do is to appreciate the work or absorb the work in an intuitive way, really the way artists work. Artists, usually good, really great ones, I don't know if you'll agree with this, they work intuitively. They don't really have a real plan. Things happen and other things happen and it takes them in directions. And I think that when you look at artwork in a context and you go and you look at artwork and none of it's stated, you don't really know when or where or why it was done, in a way you come to your own sense of where and when and why it was done. And it forces you to use the side of your brain in thinking about artistic process as the artist uses in creating, going through their process and creating the work of art. So yeah, to answer your question, a long answer, I love it.
Relative to this, I think it's worth mentioning that the Golden Lion Award at the Venice Biennial, which is coming up in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like this, is being given to a performance artist by the name of Carolee Schneemann. And Carolee has, throughout her career, insisted that her performances were meant to function as a three-dimensional statement that was going to somehow transform the way we understood the body of woman in relation to mind, the mind-body relationship. This has always been a strong point for Carolee, and this takes us away from the idea of the model in the studio as being passive and unspoken, and suddenly there is someone standing, unclothed, who is presenting herself as a mind thinking in relation to what her body means in relation to the society in which she lives, which tends to be male-dominated. I think it's wonderful that she is getting this award. I remember in 1990 seeing an exhibition of hers at the Venice Biennial and thinking in the future she will get this award, and she did.
I think what's interesting about Carolee also, and I know it's an issue for her because I've written about her quite a bit and she's become a really good friend, is that there's so much more to her work than just her nude body. You know, there's a whole world of sculpture. There's a whole, and it really does not get focused on as much as, you know, her more sensational works. It's almost like trying to separate Linda Benglis from that early photograph where she posed nude with a huge dildo. You know, there's much more, and I think that with someone like Carolee Schneemann, there's that opportunity to kind of connect the whole idea of performance, interactive art, with traditional sculpture and with painting, because she does it all.
Well, she began as a painter.
Yeah.
She deliberately mispronounced Cézanne's name and called him Cézanne was a great painter, because Ani, get it, was a woman's name. Anyway, she's an interesting artist to be sure, and the comment that I've heard numerous times about it not being about the body or however that can be expressed, you know, I kind of disagree with that. I think that this is totally the focal point of Carolee. It's just where she takes it and the direction she takes it in terms of meaning, I think, is superlative.
I agree with that. But what I was saying is that most people aren't really aware of this huge body of other work that very much comes out of that, but which doesn't really get focused on as much.
We've interviewed Carolee a couple of times over the years, and that raises a question we thought we might talk about. What's the difference between a critical article and an interview? The balance of the two in the magazine goes back and forth. Sometimes we're all or mostly interviews. Sometimes there are very few interviews in there. My own position has always been that there's always a place in the discussion and dialogue for the artist's voice. But that on the other hand, I was trained in a school of criticism that stated that the artist's voice isn't privileged over anybody else's voice when it comes to interpreting the work. So you have the artist's voice and you have the critic. Is there a difference between the two, and what sort of balance should there be?
I think it becomes a very different kind of piece that you are writing when you are doing an interview and when you're doing an article. Whether you're doing if you're doing an article and not an interview, you're still going to be interviewing the artist. Okay, but your focus is going to be very different. It's interesting because there is an interview in this issue, the May issue, with Barty Kerr. Is that just the way you pronounce her name? And she's asked that question in the piece, and she says that she finds that she likes the interview because it's a way to get out, apropos of what we were just saying about Carolee, it's a way of getting out into the public things that are not ordinarily written about. The artist, the artist when interviewed, can also correct what he or she thinks are things that have been said. I remember once, I won't mention who the artist is, but she had said to me that, because I asked her about the impact of Chinese scroll painting, on her work, and she laughed and she said that she was giving a talk some years ago, and she happened to put up a slide of a Chinese scroll painting and make some kind of reference to it. And ever since that, anyone who writes about her talks about the impact of Chinese scroll painting on her work. And in part, that came out of the fact that her father she's part Chinese. And she said, actually, Chinese scroll painting has very little to do with anything that I actually do, but that kind of stuck. So if you're interviewing, even if you're writing the article, I think it's more effective when that comes out as part of an interview than if as a writer you're putting it into the article, you know. Glenn usually gives a choice when you pitch a story or an idea, and they'll say, you know, interview or article, your choice. And then I very often will go back to the artist and say, what would you prefer? And it's interesting because there are some artists who just, no question about it, they want to be interviewed, because that gives them an opportunity to really get their own thoughts about their work out there without that much intervention, really, by the interviewer who may be leading them on, but they can go in their own direction with the interview. So some of them do that, but you'd be surprised at the number of them that say, no, I want you to write an article. An article takes a lot more sweat and tears for the writer, because you're having to do a great deal of research. You have to write it in a context. You have to make it a story. You have to bring in the artist's persona. And I find it very challenging and very exciting, very different from the interview. But the number of artists who will say, no, I want an article because I want my work to be seen in the context I know you're going to do all the research to put it in. So I think it really comes out about 50-50. I don't know if Robert's experience with that is similar.
I really intensely dislike interviews, and I intensely dislike being interviewed. It's just not my medium. And I think in recent years it's become part of the social media, if we can call it that. And I think it's losing ground in terms of any kind of authority. I would much rather be a serious writer thinking and focusing on the artist's work, writing about the artist's work from that point of view.
I'm going to ask Glenn a question. What do you think that your readers want?
I'm not sure. I can tell you that for the past few years, we've been applying for a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts that explains what we do as dialogue and documentation. And when we're using the word dialogue in that context, it's not interview per se, but the writer in dialogue with the work and with the art world in general, and thinking of the documentation not just as the interview either, but documentation in terms of the artist being able to say what they want to say. So in the dialogue and the documentation, we get both. But as I said, the balance varies a lot as time goes by between which one is more prevalent.
Well, I think that sometimes the interview can get really dicey, and I usually try to get to know the artist well before I give them the choice, of the interview or the article, because you have to know who you're working with. And there are some people that you really don't want to do an interview with because they're doggedly going to talk about only what they want to talk about, and they're not really going to address the issues that you think are important for the interview to bring out. The other dicey problem with an interview is that once you transcribe it, you have to put it into English, because not everybody really talks in the kind of English that makes for comprehensive reading. So now once you've edited what somebody has said, you have to let them look it back over to make sure that you haven't misquoted them, because you're playing with someone's words. So then when you send it back to them, you sometimes run into the issue where, oh no, I didn't want to say this, and they rewrite this esoteric, boring thing, and then you really have to kind of redo the interview and say, hey, wait a minute, this is supposed to be an interview and whatever. So you do run into that with an interview in ways that you don't run into that problem if you're just, doing writing. And I do agree with Robert that it's a far more challenging intellectually and more meaningful to me as a writer when I write an article than it is when I do an interview.
Yeah, I guess my remarks in terms of taking maybe an overstated position about the interview is somebody is doing a book on me, and it's involved with a lot of interviews. It was originally for the Institute of American... What is the Smithsonian thing called?
Oh, the Smithsonian American Art Museum.
Yeah. It was originally supposed to be for that. But anyway, the point is that I've got this on my desktop, these interviews, and I just can't read them. I don't want to read them. And this guy keeps calling me up saying, have you read them yet? Have you read them yet? And I just, they're boring to me. Maybe it's because it's me. Maybe it's because I'm boring. But, I don't want to read them, I'd much rather have somebody write something that is much more investigative in the sense of a motivation, in the sense of a practice, in the sense of how one generates energy through one's manner of being as an artist or as a critic, whatever it is. I think that energy is important. In that sense, I'm probably half Chinese because I really believe in this idea of the slow release of energy in art. I think it's a great concept that the Chinese came up with back in the late Han Dynasty. And for that reason, I spend a great deal of my time, as I think Glenn is aware, going to China, where I'll be this summer, working with Chinese artists, and that's interesting to me right now. That's truly interesting to me. I should say that I wrote the first dissertation on conceptual art in the United States in 1978, and when I found out about Chinese art, I said, what's the point of conceptual art? Everything in China is conceptual, but it's also so lucid in relation to materials and to form. There's no separation. And that became much more interesting for me.
I think getting back to sculpture a little bit, I've heard material culture described as thinking with things, and I think that's what sculptors do, that thinking in three dimensions, thinking with things, if it's in terms of assemblage or installation work, or thinking with the body if it's more performance art. But that led me into thinking about sculpture in terms of phenomenology, really, because thinking about acting in the world, and sculpture is a way of presenting in physical form, a form of acting in the world, being in the world, in the way that phenomenology deals with. I think of sculpture as being, in a way, doing philosophy in three dimensions.
Oh, that's great. I love that.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Questions?
No, yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead. Is there a microphone out there, or?
Thank you. I came a little late, but I'm very interested in the concept of what sculpture is. In other words, the definition, my understanding is that if you take something and you sculpt it, you're changing its form. So my question is, how small does something have to be to consider it sculpture? And combining that with conceptual art, if I take a seed, a natural seed, and place it next to a leaf and mount it, am I sculpting or am I assembling? In other words, basically, how small does something have to be considered sculpture?
It's very hard to speculate on something that is not art. And you're talking about ideas of speculation. There is some very small sculpture that I've seen in Shanghai in this magnificent museum that goes back centuries and centuries, and it's very, very small sculptures carved out of stones. And I'm always amazed when I see that, because it's so un-Western in its thought process, and yet it's so poignant and so present and assertive, and it's very, very small. On the other hand, I have to say that I think because things are getting bigger and bigger, sculpture is getting bigger and bigger, certainly in the West, and a lot of it is quite trivial. So I don't think we can actually equate a qualitative measure in relation to scale alone. I think there has to be something much more internalized in order to find a form. I've always been interested in this philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein. In the second part of his Tractatus, which was published in 1921, he says, form is the possibility of structure. And I have cited this statement many, many times, and read the book many times, but the point is this, that I think to make form out of the parameters that are available in terms of structure, it could be anything, light, shape, color, texture, whatever they are. That's a formal idea. But anyway, the point is that how do you aggregate them in a way that is going to have this poignance and this presence I'm talking about in these very small stone-carved Chinese sculpture? And there's no formula for that. And there's no way to speculate on it. You have to see the work, you have to feel the work, you have to know the work on the level of what it is.
There's a German artist named Christian Lohr who makes sculpture out of windblown seeds. And some of them are collected in a shape about the size of your hand, but some of them are forests that are about this tall, forests of these seeds. They may be that big around and about that tall, with just a selection of a dozen or so of these seeds. She says during an exhibition, her enemy is the vacuum cleaner, but she makes you lean over and look at it. The sculpture that's there, which is quite beautiful, is also a process of making you lean over to look at it. There's a physical process of looking at it that's part of what she's talking about. So scale can affect in various ways the way you look at something. I think that I wouldn't dictate scale to an artist because I think they're always going to teach me something about it in the work.
The reason I brought it up is because you mentioned sculptor as being thinking in ideas or ideas in things,
Right.
Thinking, and then the composition of what exactly is conceptual art. I think, therefore I am. So in a way, the way Chinese art is all conceptual, maybe all art is all sculpture. It gets very philosophical, but I would just,
Sure, I think in a way our process of thinking about and categorizing art is always misleading. And frequently the categories that are imposed on artists like minimalism or arte povera don't come from the artists. They come from critics thinking about art. And whatever we as critics impose on artists in terms of, and just like the scroll painting, an artist will and must go beyond that and lead us forward to think about something bigger and more important than categories.
Well, I think that criticism needs a germination coming from art. If you don't know art, you shouldn't be a critic. I think that thinking like an artist is a way of getting inside the artist and dealing with the artist. And I have heard this so many times in terms of articles that I've written about artists. How did you know this is exactly the way I think? I have no way of answering that. Although, I'm an artist myself, and so I relate to how other artists think and their emotions. Because artists tend to be very sensitive, and because of that sensibility or sensitivity and sensibility, perhaps they get impatient at times, and it's very difficult to settle on one thing in terms of meaning in relation to an artist's work.
Any other questions? There was, I think it was Whistler who said that writing criticism is like trying to tattoo a soap bubble. A soap bubble. And there was another, he was actually a theater critic in the 19th century, an American theater critic, who said that good criticism is important to a city as good drainage. And there's a range of thinking about criticism and what its role can be, what its importance can be, that is maybe in the process of changing now because so many newspapers are turning their art critics into city government writers instead, or just firing the art critics, and art criticism is falling to the volunteers in the blogs or to monthlies and quarterlies like Sculpture and other magazines instead of dailies. And the role of criticism is changing as our relationship in time to exhibitions changes. One of the reasons we do that NEA grant about calling ourselves documentation is that we're not responding to a show in a way that's going to drive an audience to the show, because by the time we get it in the magazine, the show's not up anymore. On the other hand, when a show isn't up anymore, it's gone. And the only record of it is in the criticism. It's in the review. So we're not able to do one kind of thing of importance or relation to an exhibition, but we're able to do something else.
I feel very sorry for a lot of the artists today because there are so few venues where they can actually get their work out there. The number of them is just getting thinner and thinner. I used to cover the arts for the New York Times on Long Island and Westchester, and they've cut all of that coverage.
Oh, yeah.
All of that coverage. They no longer have that section that's for New Jersey, Connecticut, Long Island, Westchester. They've cut it. And the museums and the arts institutions in the surrounding metropolitan areas can no longer depend upon that. And so there are so many artists who are not going to get their work reviewed, are not going to get their work covered. And it's become more and more difficult because so much of it is just on all these blogs, 9/10 of them you've never heard of, and you really don't know who's written them. Glenn indicated when we opened this talk that you don't go into writing this because you want to make a great living. It pays very, very poorly, and today I would say a large percentage of the publications don't pay at all. They don't pay at all. So you have to wonder what would encourage a young person today to go into this field. It's becoming more and more of a problematic thing for the artist and for the public to have a handle on where they can go for some good critical thought. I think Sculpture Magazine is one of the few of them that still continues to do that.
Maybe I can end on a positive note with regard to that. For all the difficulties that there are doing serious criticism now, there is a range of publications that have grown up in recent years, from the Brooklyn Rail that Robert I think does a lot of good work, to something as ephemeral as the Bad at Sports podcast, which comes out of Chicago. There's a range of these things across the country, a lot of them being started by artists. They are sometimes focused on regional art, and sometimes Bad at Sports, for instance, takes on national issues and in both in terms of the artist's rights as well as serious critical issues. So I think people are beginning to think how we can make this engagement between artists and the public, artists and critics, serious consideration of art. People are beginning to think of those things in terms of how we can go forward in the current media climate to do something creative and serious with writing about sculpture and everything else. Any contribution any of you would make to this dialogue would be constructive. I think it's going to have to come out of people thinking in these new media and thinking of ways to insert this kind of serious discussion into the maze. I have heard the internet described not as the information superhighway, but the information landfill. And in that context, it's going to take creative means to bring things to people's attention in ways that are serious and constructive.
Just one point of correction. I don't write for the Brooklyn Rail anymore because of this issue, because I felt that I should be paid, a critic of my stature. So I went to Hyperallergic, and I'm perfectly happy because they keep raising my salary. And also, I think I have better editing. So and needless to say, for Glenn, you know, I've been working as long as you've been, I think, at the magazine, or nearly as long. And it's just a great place to work. Because I don't have to worry about those things. You know, when you can kind of just focus on the work, then you've got what you need. And that's what I get from Sculpture Magazine.
Thank you.
And thank you, Glenn, for doing this.
Oh, thanks. And thank you for coming. I hope you got something out of it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.